Alright, this screencast is going to be kind of long. It's going to cover all the material you need to know for Chapter 10, which is all about the period known as Reconstruction that occurs right after the Civil War. So, we know that Abraham Lincoln is president towards the end of the Civil War, and before the war is even over, when it looks like it looks like the North is going to secure the win, Lincoln begins making plans for Reconstruction and readmitting the South into the Union, because that's what Reconstruction is really focused on during this time. How do we readmit the South back into the United States? What punishment is given? What rights are they given again? How quickly are they given those rights? That's what the period of Reconstruction is determined to figure out. So Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was called the 10% plan. And as part of the 10% plan, 10% of a state's population would take an oath of allegiance to the United States. Lincoln's 10% plan also said that all Confederates in the South would be pardoned except for any high-ranking officials. And then the third aspect of Lincoln's plan was that in order for a southern state to be readmitted to the Union, it had to formally abolish slavery and ratify the 13th Amendment. So with those three things in action, a state would be able to return to the Union. Now, Congress does not respond too keenly towards Lincoln's 10% plan. You have radical Republicans, and radical Republicans are going to refer to not just any Republican, but Republicans who really wanted to punish the South and shame the South for their actions after the Civil War. And they feel that Lincoln's 10% plan is just too weak. They want to punish the South more harshly. So they are going to pass their answer to Lincoln's plan. They kind of propose their own plan called the Wade-Davis Bill. And the Wade-Davis Bill called for the following things. Rather than only 10% of a state's population having to pledge an oath of loyalty, the majority of a voting population had to pledge an oath of loyalty to the United States. It also stated that only those that did not fight in the Confederate Army would be allowed to participate in the formation of a new state government. Think about, though, how few people in the South had no role in the Confederate Army. So it's really limiting who can have a role in the government, in the creation of the new government. But they did say that only those that were not fighting in the war could actually participate in that new state government's formation. Lastly, it said that Confederate leaders would be permanently disenfranchised, meaning Confederate leaders will not be allowed to vote, period, ever again. Now, Congress did pass the Wade-Davis Bill, but this will be pocket vetoed by Lincoln, meaning he does not sign it. He does not directly veto it, but he fails to sign it by the deadline, and so it is pocket vetoed. Now, many of us know that President Lincoln is a president who was assassinated, so he will not then see the Reconstruction period carried out to fruition. Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. John Wilkes Booth was a Confederate sympathizer, and when a president dies, you know that his vice president immediately takes over as president, and that is going to be Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson is by default our new president of the United States. Andrew Johnson will create his own plan for Reconstruction, and it called for the following things. He pardoned all Confederates that pledged an oath of allegiance to the U.S., except any Confederate leader and any wealthy Southern plantation owner. He pretty much blames plantation owners for the war. Also, per Johnson's plan, states had to nullify their ordinance of secession, basically publicly saying that that was void and unconstitutional. States were also obliged to ratify the 13th Amendment. And Johnson also decided that states could decide for themselves what the rights of the newly freedmen would be. Your freedmen referred to your former slaves. So he's going to allow southern states to decide what rights these newly freed African Americans have. And by the end of 1865, per Johnson's Reconstruction plan, all states had re-entered the Union as once again states of the United States of America. All those southern states that seceded are now once again part of the U.S. We're going to look at what life in the South is like after the Civil War, particularly for African Americans. So, almost immediately after the Civil War and after the states are, or the slaves are emancipated, state laws start being passed that deny African Americans the most basic rights. It's basically a way to still limit the freedmen as much as possible. They were not allowed to vote, they were not allowed to carry weapons, they were forced to have very long work days and weeks by law. They had restricted mobility, they had curfews, basically just lots of rules on these African Americans, and it was just a way to keep African Americans in inferior positions. So we see that while African Americans are now legally not allowed to serve as true slaves, they will not be seeing any sort of social equality anytime soon in the South. Now, as a response to this, some Republicans do urge Congress to pass into action what's known as the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a government organization aimed at providing aid and assistance to these newly freed African Americans following the Civil War. The goal of the organization was to help freedmen transition into their new lives, helping them to get an education, find jobs, find homes, etc. Another strong effort by the Republicans in Congress would be the passage of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment states that all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. were citizens. So, you know, the 14th Amendment is something that's used today in a lot of Supreme Court cases, but the main premise of the 14th Amendment as it relates to post-Civil War is that it grants African Americans citizenship. Because they were born in the U.S., it officially states that they are, in fact, American citizens. The 14th 14th Amendment also states that a state could not deprive any citizens of their rights or equal protection under the law. So that is, in a sense, saying that the black codes that the South is instating are unconstitutional, but we will see that they will remain in the South for some years to come. We're going to see a more radical effort come out of Congress to really kind of control the South a little more in terms of their disregard for the new rights of these African American citizens. And that's definitely another push by the radical Republicans. So this next period of Reconstruction is known as Radical Reconstruction. The radical Republicans in Congress passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867. This divided the South into military districts as pictured on the screen, and basically federal troops were sent into each individual district to command that district. And the troops' purpose of being in these southern districts was to force social change on the South in the following ways. Basically ensuring that African Americans were being granted their voting rights. Note, there's no constitutional amendment for that just yet. We'll get there in a second. But saying African Americans should be granted their voting rights. Number 2, the purpose of the troops was to force the states to ratify the 14th Amendment. Number 3, to make sure that the new state constitutions that were being created were acceptable and constitutional. And number 4, to make sure that Confederate leaders who are supposed to be disenfranchised were not voting. And so we see this radical Reconstruction in place in the South for some years. Now, Andrew Johnson and Congress did not really get along very well. Andrew Johnson was almost more of a Democrat than a Republican. He certainly wasn't a radical Republican, and so many of the radical Republican legislature that is going through Congress in terms of civil rights bills and rights towards African Americans, Johnson is vetoing these bills left and right, and this really upsets Congress greatly. We see this man on the screen, Edward Stanton. I don't need you to know his name for the test, but he is one of the last radical Republicans that was on Lincoln's cabinet. He was the Secretary of War under President Lincoln, and Johnson kind of inherited him. Johnson had begun dismissing all of his radical Republican cabinet members since he did not see eye to eye philosophically with them. Stanton was that last member on the cabinet, and the Congress was really hopeful that Johnson would leave him alone, but Johnson will actually remove him from office, and soon after that the House of Representatives votes to impeach Johnson. And we know that impeachment means to formally charge with a crime. It does not actually mean they are officially thrown out of office. It would go up to trial in the Senate. Johnson was tried in the Senate. The moderate Republicans and the Democrats are siding with him. The radical Republicans are heavily voting to remove him from office. But by just one vote shy, he is not removed from office. He is found not guilty. So he is the first president to be impeached, but he is not successfully removed from office. But there will soon be a new president in town, because in the presidential election of 1868, Ulysses S. Grant, who was the former Union general, very popular during the Civil War in the North, he is the Republican candidate. The Democrats are kind of in a sham because, most of the Democrats reside in the South, and they're still kind of seen as unpatriotic following the Civil War. So the Republicans will easily win this election, and President Ulysses S. Grant is easily elected as the next president of the United States. One of the first things that happens under Grant's presidency is Congress's approval of the 15th Amendment, which stated that neither federal nor state governments could deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In layman's terms, African Americans are now constitutionally granted the right to vote. This does strictly say African American men, as it did not say in the 15th Amendment that the right to vote could be denied based on gender or sex. So women are still not enfranchised fully, but African Americans are. So it does protect African Americans' right to vote. Now, even though this amendment does kind of grant them the right to vote, it kind of leaves the door open for other voting restrictions to be put on place, such as poll taxes, property requirements, literacy tests, violence at the polls. You will see the South go above and beyond in attempts to prevent African Americans from being able to exercise their right to vote, which is really disgusting. Race relations really are kind of at an all-time low in the South when the 15th Amendment is passed through Congress. Former slave owners just really can't accept the new position of their former slaves. They did not like that they are moving up in the social status ladder. And so we're going to see the institution of segregation begin in the South, which is basically the separation of races, everything from water fountains to, bathrooms to restaurants, hospitals. They're all separated, black and white. And the whites version of all of these things was typically nicer, which is not fair. And this institution will exist in our country for over 100 years, and we'll talk about the Supreme Court case that allows it to exist for so long a little bit later. Another thing that really shines an ugly light in the South during this time is the Ku Klux Klan, very notorious and widespread vigilante group. Basically, their main goal was to destroy the Republican Party in the South and to also prevent African Americans from exercising their rights. They are responsible for hundreds of murder of men, women, and children. They did operate in secret, disguised in white robes, but they are a very violent and illegal group that existed and kind of came to the plate during this time. Okay, changes in Southern economy. We're going to see that, in terms of the work that African Americans are doing in the South, they are very limited in their job opportunities, most of them working on plantations because that's really all they know and all they have skill and experience in. And we're going to see Southern plantation owners kind of attempt to still have them somewhat working as slaves, but not as actual slaves, because that would be illegal, but the next closest thing, basically. First of all, African Americans work farmland through the institution of sharecropping. Basically, slaves need land to work, and former slave owners need workers because they no longer have them. So they kind of together go into an agreement where former slaves get to stay on plantations, they get a piece of land to farm, and they get to basically live off what their cropping or farming and the crops that they're farming, but the rest of it goes to the plantation owner, of course, and they're given a very small wage, but the plantation owner would usually allow them to live on the farm without paying rent. Tenant farming would be kind of a similar process, okay, except for the fact that workers would pay rent with cash, and then they would get to keep all the crops and sell the crops for a profit. Alright, the collapse of Reconstruction. In terms of opposition to Reconstruction, obviously, with radical Reconstruction specifically, white Southerners did not like it. The KKK is becoming even more aggressive in the South. They started to lead small little revolutions in the South against radical Republicans. Congress will respond to this. They passed the Enforcement Acts. The Enforcement Acts provided federal supervision for elections, and it also gave the president the power to use federal troops wherever the KKK was active. Now we're going to see Reconstruction end with a secret compromise called the Compromise of 1877. We're not going to get into the details of this little secret deal because it was a bit secretive, but essentially it did involve the presidential election of the next president, Rutherford B. Hayes. But essentially the Compromise of 1877 provided for the removal of federal troops from the South, so that the South is no longer going to be under military districts and military control, and once those troops leave, Reconstruction is over. Now, Reconstruction is kind of deemed as a failure by most historians. The rights of the newly freed slaves are not, the former slaves, the freedmen, are not secure. Their rights are not secure. And the discrimination towards them will continue for many decades. The South really isn't that happy either, because their economy is still greatly suffered since the end of the Civil War because of things like total war, and Reconstruction didn't really do anything to help get their economy flourishing again. And these are all the notes I'm going to have you learn for Chapter 10. So please write down any questions, and we will review this when it comes time to review for the test on next Wednesday.